already getting questions from the audience, which is great. This visual, we're talking about representation at different levels of seniority. Question here from an audience member about representation in types of job. And this audience member is specifically interested in product management and engineering, which have historically been tougher for companies to fill with women. Do we have any data on those fields?
That's a fantastic question. It's especially relevant because I think across all industries, not just in tech, we've seen that as technology is creating new jobs and automation is changing the labor force, that these are roles that are the fastest growing roles across all industries. And so the answer is yes, we do see disparities when it comes to women's representation in engineering and product management roles. And it's not just in tech, it's in these other industries as well. These figures are not only worse than overall women's representation this year, but they're actually even worse than women's representation in 2016. So that gives you an idea how far back women's representation looks in these particular roles. And so the pipeline for women in engineering and product roles is really trailing. And as you know, we see this shift in the labor force, it will be critical for us to start making improvements in women's representation in these technical roles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you.
So let's also talk a little bit about the gains at the top. I think it's really important to note that although we are excited to see these gains at the top, they're quite unsustainable because of something we call the broken rung. And this broken rung is the first step up to manager from entry level. Since the beginning of our research, we've seen the same trend. Women are promoted to manager at far lower rates than men are. And this makes it nearly impossible for companies to lay the foundation for sustained progress at more senior levels. So this year, only 86 women were promoted for every 100 men at the first step up to manager. Encouragingly, for the first time in our 7 years of research, we actually saw that women of color were promoted to manager at about that same rate. So 85 women of color were promoted for every 100 men. This is an improvement over the dismal 79 a year ago. So we call out this progress, but it's really progress that's critical for companies to build on. Unless they make promotion rates truly equitable, they'll never be able to overcome the broken rung and make progress at the top sustainable.
Another finding that really makes us concerned about the sustainability of small gains in the pipeline is the increasing burnout rate for women. Our data shows that while all employees are increasingly burnt out compared to last year in our pandemic, the gap between burnout levels for men and women has nearly doubled in the past year. A big factor contributing to this, as we've all experienced, is the always-on nature of remote work. We may have eliminated our commute, but we're all sleeping at the office. And not only is the burnout bad from the perspective of caring for our employees, but we also find that it hurts companies in terms of productivity and talent retention, talent being the greatest competitive advantage. Employees who are always on are 2.1 times more likely to be burnt out, and employees who are burnt out are about 1.6 times more likely to consider leaving their companies or switching to companies with better work-life balance. And we're seeing evidence of this begin to bear out in the great attrition. On the next slide, we find that one of the emphases in this year's report was that despite feeling burnt out and exhausted, women leaders were taking on a large portion of the labor in supporting colleagues' well-being, sponsoring them, investing in diversity, equity, and inclusion in their companies. Yet this work is too often under-recognized and undervalued. We see in the data that across the board, women managers are doing more to support their colleagues in a number of ways, and it's here on the right of the screen. It's important to note that this data is not self-reported by managers, but instead it's based on what employees say their managers have done for them, and if their managers were women or men. We find here, women managers are supporting colleagues more than men managers across almost all of our well-being measures, such as providing emotional support, checking in on well-being, helping taking actions to prevent or manage burnout, managing the workload, and navigating work-life challenges. Women also take a heavier load of sponsorship. Senior women are sponsoring roughly 2 times more junior colleagues than men at their levels. And these are colleagues of all genders and backgrounds, even though senior men outnumber senior women 2 to 1. And this is especially true when it comes to sponsoring women and women of color. Senior leader women are sponsoring 2.5 times as many as their male peers. Women leaders are also doing more when it comes to spending time on DE&I work, but it's often not part of formal job responsibilities. And as they get more senior, interestingly, and progress across the pipeline, that differential expands. This means that on top of additional sponsorship and well-being work, they're also contributing to DE&I effort at companies, sometimes 2 times more, looking at senior leader women at the same level.
Shauna, I'm going to interrupt, forgive me here, with an audience question that I think is kind of important. Recognizing that it's early days, do we have any insight into the impact of this additional labor that women have begun to shoulder?
We do. We see it as critical. Right now, employees in the Great Attrition note that what they most value about their companies, a sense of purpose, a sense of caring, a feeling of belonging. And so this work that senior women leaders and women leaders across the board are doing is almost fundamental to retaining talent, as well as having a talent competitive advantage in this current market.
Thanks, Ashana. We also see that, this work that women are doing is, despite the fact that for the most part, women are often having a tougher time and a tougher experience in the workplace. All women are more likely than men to face microaggressions at work. And this actually increases as they get more senior and more tenured. In fact, senior level women are about 2 times as likely to experience microaggressions compared to men at their level. And for women with other traditionally marginalized identities, these experiences are even more frequent, and they reflect a wider range of biases. So we generally look at 2 flavors of microaggressions. The first is, challenge to competence. For example, you'll see here being interrupted or being spoken over. The second type is really disrespectful or othering behavior. And this can include things like overhearing jokes about people like you. If you look at LGBTQ women and women with disabilities, you see that they're significantly more likely than women overall, even, to experience microaggressions where their competence is challenged or undermined. Women with disabilities in particular are much more likely than women overall to experience this at work. 40% are interrupted or spoken over, compared to 28%, of all women, and only 15% of men. And 46% of women with disabilities experience having their judgment questioned in their area of expertise. We also see that women of color are much more likely to experience microaggressions in the form of othering and disrespectful behavior. This is unfortunately most pronounced for Black women, who you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen experience microaggressions down every single one of these rows. Compared to white women, Black women are more than 3 times as likely, and Latinas and Asian women are twice as likely to overhear insults about their culture and to hear people express surprise at their language skills or other abilities. And Black women are 6 times more likely than white women to feel like they have to speak on behalf of all people of their identity. Additionally, if we actually look at the only experience, we see that consistent to prior years, their experiences are worse than non-onlys. So an only is someone who finds themselves as the only woman in the room or on their team. This year, we also looked at what we call double onlys. So not only are you the only woman in the room, but you're the only one of your gender and race or ethnicity. And if you're a double only, you're much more likely to experience disrespectful or othering behavior. This matters because a lot of women of color, actually 1 in 8, are double onlys, and they are 2 to 3 times more likely than non-onlys to experience things like people expressing surprise at their language skills or their other abilities, being confused with someone else of their same race, or overhearing insults about people like them or their culture. So, given this experience, it's really important to get allyship right. Allyship is something that's critical for all employees, and our research finds that when people have strong allies, they have a much better experience. They're more likely to be happy with their job, to recommend their company to others, and they're less likely to be burned out and to have considered leaving their jobs. This is especially important, obviously, for women of color. Not only do women of color still face higher rates of microaggressions, as we discussed, they also still lack active allies. We continue to see a troubling gap. Although more than 3/4 of white employees consider themselves allies to women of color at work, less than half take basic allyship actions, such as speaking out against bias or advocating for new opportunities for women of color. There's a notable disconnect between the stated intent of people who want to be allies, who self-identify as allies, versus people who are taking action as allies.
Jess, question here on the how, actually a few questions. In other words, what does the research say about how white employees can be successful allies to colleagues who are women of color? What are the most meaningful actions any of us might take?
That's a great question. We actually, in our research, did ask women of color and all employees what the most effective allyship actions are. And we actually saw a bit of a disconnect. Women of color told us that the number one thing an ally could do was to advocate for new opportunities for them. They also called out, actively working to confront discrimination and publicly acknowledging their ideas and their work. So now let's take a look at the path ahead. And Ashana, maybe you can talk us through some of the actions companies can take to create diverse and inclusive workplaces.
Absolutely, Jess, thanks. As you look to the next slide, this year, we looked back at companies who had consistently participated in women in the workplace and identified those that are performing ahead of the pack. These companies do better than their industry peers in terms of representation for both women and women of color, and they've made improvements at most levels of the pipeline, and they have consistent year-on-year gains on women representation. And we call these companies top performers. We looked at what they say they are doing compared to companies overall, and we found a set of standard levers. First, as you'll see here, top performers track diversity metrics, not just by gender and race, but also at the intersection of both. We found that companies, need to both more fully track representation as well as hiring and promotion outcomes. And although most companies track representation for women overall, far fewer do this for women of color, which means that companies are missing the critical visibility they need to make progress. Companies have also and would also benefit by tracking hiring and promotions to determine whether women, and especially women of color, are being hired and promoted at similar rates to other employees. If they see gaps, they may need to fine-tune their hiring and promotion processes, and more broadly, ensure that all women are getting the mentorship, sponsorship, and professional development needed to advance.
Shauna, I'm mindful of time, but very quickly, we have another question on how here. Any examples from your client work on how leaders are tracking diversity successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the clients I'm working with has made public commitments to diversity and has done so both overall and at the intersection. And that creates both public accountability as well as internal organizational accountability. Another client I'm working with has a dashboard that they look and they track these metrics, and every week and every quarter are bringing them into regular conversation among senior management. If we move to the next slide, we found, in addition to tracking diversity metrics, 100% of top performers hold senior leaders accountable for progress on diversity. It's interesting to note on this point that top performing companies are putting teeth into accountability as well, some through financial incentives and at times financial penalties for not meeting goals. To accelerate progress for all women on all fronts, companies need to double down on accountability. Despite saying, as just mentioned at the onset, that gender and racial diversity are among their most important business priorities, only about 2/3 of companies hold senior leaders accountable for progress on diversity goals, and less than 1/3 hold managers, who play a critical role in hiring and promotion decisions across the pipeline, accountable. Moreover, among companies that hold senior leaders accountable, less than half factor progress on diversity metrics into performance reviews, and far fewer provide any sort of incentives for meeting goals. Companies need to treat diversity as they would a business priority, and that includes tying progress towards goals to advancement. We also see that companies should ensure they're applying the same best practices with the same level of rigor across both hiring and performance reviews and minimize gender bias in these processes. Companies are currently doing more to reduce bias in hiring, for example. Almost 2/3 of companies offer bias training focused on hiring, compared to less than half of companies that offer this for evaluators involved in performance reviews. But performance reviews largely determine promotion outcomes, and they help advance talent from within, which means making them equitable is critical to fixing that broken rung that just mentioned and advancing more women across the pipeline. When we move to more broadly inclusion, what do we see? We see top performers across the board, and this is almost table stakes, are providing mentorship and sponsorship programs. And they distinguish between the two. Mentorship, the person that you can call at any point for advice on your career. Sponsorship, the person that is actually helping create an opportunity for you, either a new role or simply an opportunity to speak in a meeting. They have programs for women overall, they have programs for women of color, and they support employees through employee resource groups. We also see that top performing companies have more allyship and intersectionality trainings for all employees, and especially in the past year, we've seen these increase in frequency. It's important that DE&I training covers the right material with the right level of specificity. For example, only about half of the companies say that their bias training addresses intersectionality, which means many employees are missing a crucial perspective on the experience of colleagues with 2 or more traditionally marginalized identities, the double onlys, as just mentioned, including women of color, LGBTQ+ women, and women with disabilities, which, by the way, represent 1 in 10 women in the workforce. We see finally that top performing companies, and returning to the topic of burnout and some of the unique challenges in our pandemic, top performing companies are more likely to and have expanded well-being supports in the past year. This looks at childcare benefits, on-site childcare, emergency childcare, for example, mental health training. Companies have demonstrated a strong commitment to employee well-being over the past year, but burnout, as I mentioned, is still on the rise, especially among women. There's no easy fix, so continued investment will be critical. And in addition to maintaining successful policies and programs companies have put in place in the past year, they should look to expand on them, try new approaches, and encourage participation and role model participation. It's important that companies really establish new norms and systems to improve employees' everyday work experiences. And even if the right policies and programs all exist, employees will continue to struggle if the cadence and expectations of their daily work feels unattainable. And this is where managers come in and the desire to role model.
Fantastic. Thank you both. We are effectively at time. There's a really good follow-up question here on burnout and effective tactics for supporting employees in fighting burnout. I'm going to refer folks to an HBR piece that Ishana was actually a co-author on. It's called Women Do More to Fight Burnout, and it's burning them out. And you can find some of those tactics in that article. Many thanks, Jess and Ishana. And of course, thanks to all of you and our McKinsey Live audience for being together with us today. If you're interested in revisiting any of these insights, watch for the replay of this session, which will be available next week on our website, mckinsey.com. And be sure to join us for our next McKinsey Live event. It's in 2 weeks on a Tuesday, November 30th, on charting a future that's not just growing, but that is also sustainable and inclusive.